The chilly breeze from the autumn air rustled the pages of your book in your hand. As you sat in the quiet corner of the Hogwarts library, you glanced around. The empty shelves. You saw you were grateful for the solitude, and returned to reading. These days it seemed like Harry was on edge more than ever. You couldn't help but share his anxieties. I mean, it was hard being his sister sometimes, not only because of the dangers that surrounded him, but because you were expected to endure them silently alongside him. Harry had a mission that he wouldn't fully share, and you felt helpless, only able to support him from the sidelines. You were too distracted to notice someone taking your seat across from you. When you finally look up, you were startled by none other than Draco Malfoy, sitting at the table, his eyes distant, an unusual darkness clouding his expression. Normally you'd exchange glares or biting remarks, but something in his appearance made you pause. He looked tired, almost haunted. Malfoy, what are you doing here? You kept your voice cold, fighting the urge to glance away. Draco flinched as if broken from a trance. He seemed to collect himself, his usual arrogance flickering to life, but only briefly. I didn't expect to see anyone here, he muttered, almost as if he was talking to himself. He raised an eyebrow. This wasn't the usual Draco Malfoy, the boy who took pleasure in tormenting your brother and taunting his family's influence and his power. It seemed like he was nowhere to be found, but curiosity got the better of you. So against your better judgment, you closed your book and leaned forward slightly. Well, I am here, you replied, softer than you meant to say it. Now, are you just gonna sit there brooding? Or... Draco's lips twitched, almost a smile. Perhaps I'm just here for the quiet. His voice was flat, but you caught that hint of honesty there. The encounter ended quietly, both of you too wary to extend the conversation, but over the following weeks it happened again and again. You'd find him lingering in empty hallways, slipping out of crowded hallways when he thought no one was looking, and each time he looked more tired. The weight on his shoulders seemed heavier. It was one afternoon in the library when Draco sat across from you once more, his head buried in his hands. A tense silence filled up the space, and you finally broke it. What is going on with you, Malfoy? You asked softly, closing your book again. Draco's gray eyes lifted, flashing with that same vulnerability you'd seen before. For a moment he seemed about to answer, but then his face hardened, the mask slipping into place. You wouldn't understand, he said, but there was no bite to his tone. You narrowed your eyes. Try me. He looked at you, his gaze searching, perhaps wondering if he could really trust you. It's complicated, he said, finally sounding devastated. Things I don't have any control over. Against your better judgment, you felt almost a pang of sympathy. Maybe it's because you'd seen Harry carry that same burden, or maybe it's because it was something deeper. Sometimes sharing your burden makes it easier, you murmured. Draco laughed, a hollow sound. Sharing a burden with you, sister of my enemy. You shot him a glare. Maybe stop labeling people and look around. You're not exactly the only one with problems, Malfoy. He held your gaze, and something softened in his expression. You know, Potter, he said quietly, you may not be as unbearable as I thought. Over the next few weeks, things between you and Draco shifted. Each encounter carried those undertones of tension and curiosity. You'd catch him staring at you from across the great hall, his usual sneer absent, replaced with something unreadable. And slowly, but cautiously, your conversations begin to grow in depth, moving from more bitter sarcasm to something almost like companionship. One evening, You found yourself alone with him once more. The rain pattered softly against the windows, casting a dim glow into the cold hallways. You leaned against a wall, Draco standing beside you in silence, lost in thought. Is it true? You asked yourself. The question for you could really stop yourself. Are you really looking for him? He stiffened. Who told you that? Harry, he's worried about what you're doing, what you've been told to do. Draco didn't respond, his face tightening for a long moment. He simply stared at the ground, his fist clenched. I don't have a choice, he said finally, his voice barely audible. You took a step closer. There's always a choice. He looked at you, his gray eyes stormy. Not for me. You don't understand. There's an edge to his voice, but beneath it you could hear the fear. Against all reason, you reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. Let me help you understand, he whispered. He stared at you, stunned. In that moment, all the tension between the two of you seemed to stop. Without thinking, he leaned in, his hand brushing against your hair. He grabbed your cheek, tilting up your face towards his. His gaze dropped, down to your lips, and for a heartbeat, the world melted away. The next instant he pulled back, horror flickering in his eyes. I can't, he muttered, stepping back through as though he had been burned. Draco, he began, reaching out for him, but he shook his head. This isn't supposed to happen. You're his sister. He'd never forgive me. He swallowed, as if the words were a struggle to get out. But when I'm with you, I feel like I'm not drowning. You held his gaze. Then stop fighting it. Without another word, Draco closed the distance between the two of you, capturing your lips in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. It felt like release, a moment suspended in time where the world outside didn't matter. For once, you were just two people untethered from your roles, your families and the expectations that were pressing the both of you down. When you finally broke apart, you agreed. You rested his forehead against your own. This can't end well, he whispered. There was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. We'll make it work, he promised, even though you weren't sure how. We'll find a way. As the weeks went by, you and Draco continued to meet in secret. Each time the world around you felt more and more dangerous, the shadow of war growing darker, yet with him, you felt a strange sense of comfort, like you were finally breaking free from the fate that you hadn't chosen. Harry began to grow suspicious. You held his watchful gaze, the questions he held back, the concern in his voice when he spoke to you about Draco, but you kept your relationship hidden, knowing it could only complicate things further. But one night, it all came crashing down. You were waiting for Draco in the room of requirement when the door burst open, and instead of Draco, Harry stood there with a look of shock and betrayal written across his face. Wyan? What's going on? His voice was barely a whisper. It was thick with hurt. He swallowed, trying to find the words, but they couldn't come out. Harry, it's not what you think. Not what I think. With Malfoy. His voice rose, disbelief and anger mingling together. The same Malfoy he's working for. You know who. It's not like that, you said, desperation creeping into your tone. He's not what you think he is. He's afraid, Harry. Harry shook his head roughly, pain flashing in his eyes. I can't believe you keep this from me. Everything. Before you could respond, Draco appeared, his face pale, as he took in the scene. Harry turned on him, wand drawn, his expression cold. Potter, he began, trying to keep his voice steady. This isn't her fault. If you want someone to blame, blame me. His jaw clenched, his grip on his wand tightening. Stay away from my sister, Malfoy. I don't know what game you're playing, but I won't let you drag her down with you. Draco glanced at you, his eyes filled with regret. For a moment you saw it, a flash of a boy you'd come to know, the boy who was trying desperately to break free from the chains around him. But in the end he couldn't argue. He simply nodded, giving you one last lingering look before turning and walking away, disappearing into the shadows. You watched him go. You couldn't believe it. Your heart was aching with a mixture of loss and hope. One day you would find him again. You knew that deep down, but the connection between the two of you was so strong it was going to take more than a couple forces to keep you apart. For now you were left alone, caught between the loyalty of your family and the undeniable bond that you'd found with the boy who had once been your enemy. But weeks had passed since then. That painful night in the room of requirement. You hadn't spoken to Draco since, and Harry's disappointment lingered, a heavy silence between the two of you. Each day you'd catch glimpses of Draco in the hallways, his face pale, drawn, his eyes hollow, and he met your gaze as if he'd become a ghost, a memory haunting the castle's corridors. The weight of it was nearly unbearable. You knew Draco had been forced to cut ties for both of you. But your heart ached. You could sense Harry's unease as well, even if he was still hurt and he seemed to worry about you. Watching closely for signs Draco's influence on you, little did he know, you didn't need Draco near to pull towards him. It was as if a part of you had been broken off and drifted in the direction he had gone. One night, unable to sleep, you found yourself wandering the dark corridors, your footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The castle was quiet, and for once you felt at peace, unable to move, without the weight of judgment or fear. You reached the astronomy tower, and you took in the night, letting the cold air clear your mind. Couldn't sleep either. The voice sent a shiver down your spine. You turned, and there he was, Draco, his face pale against the moonlight, looking like he hadn't rested in days. Draco, you whispered, feeling your heart leap. What are you doing here? He took a step forward, his gaze flickering with guilt, something else longing almost. I couldn't stay away. His voice was barely above a whisper, not when everything around me feels like it's crumbling. You shook your head, trying to hold the anger and confusion that dissolved as he drew closer. I thought we agreed it was best to keep our distance. Agreed, he scoffed, his voice trembling with frustration. I never agreed to lose you, not after everything. For a long moment, you simply stared at each other, the silence thick between the two of you, the words left unsaid. Then without thinking, you closed the distance. Wrapping your arms around him, he clung to you, his touch desperate as if he was trying to memorize the feel of you, to hold on to something amidst the storm around him. Draco, You hesitated, struggling to find the words. He leaned back enough just to look you in the eye. I know. You don't have to say it. But the quiet moment was shadowed as footsteps echoed in the corridor. Both of you froze. Draco's expression hardened. I can't be seen together, he whispered and pulled away reluctantly. You nodded, heart pounding, as if you quickly slipped into the shadows, disappearing just as quickly as he had come. You make your way back to your room, unable to shake the feeling that this moment with Draco had only deepened the bond between the two of you and the danger surrounding it. In the days that followed, you felt the tension building at Hogwarts. Dark rumors were circulating, whispers of Death Eaters plotting within the castle. Harry was growing more anxious, and the professors were on edge. Even Draco seemed to be avoiding his friends, his figure slinking through the hallways, alone and burdened by something heavy and terrible. One evening, you were helping Harry research in the library when he brought up a subject you had both been avoiding. Why, I know there's something going on between you and Malfoy, Harry said, not even meeting your eyes. But you have to understand. He's dangerous. Whatever he's involved in, it's more than we can imagine. You bristled, feeling defensive. Here he's in over his head. I know he's made mistakes, but I don't think he wants to be a part of this. He's afraid. Harry sighed, running a hand through his hair. Maybe he's scared, but he's still doing their bidding. If he wanted to change sides, he'd have done it by now. You knew he was right, at least in part. Draco had always been drawn to something terrible, something tangled in the darkness, but you couldn't shake the feeling that he is more than just what Harry saw. He was a scared, trapped boy struggling against the chains that he didn't choose. The turning point came one night when you stumbled upon Draco in the dungeons. You heard muffled sounds, then followed it, drawn by instinct or maybe just hope. Here he was, back to the wall, eyes wide, looking more broken than ever. His hands were shaking and he had a small glittering pile in one hand. "Draco?" you whisper, horror rising within you when he realized it was poison. His gaze snapped up. He tried to hide the vial. His expression betrayed him. "Don't come any closer," he whispered, his voice cracked. "I can't do this anymore, YN." You took a step forward, unafraid. "Draco, don't. Please." A tear slipped down his cheek, and for a moment he looked like the lost boy, vulnerable and afraid. "I don't know how to escape this. They want me to. I can't." You reached for him, gently prying the vial from his hand. He didn't resist, his gaze locked on yours, his breathing unsteady. "You're not alone, Draco," he whispered, clutching his hands tightly. "We'll figure it out. Together." He sagged, leaning into your touch, his face buried in your shoulder. You looked at him as he shook, feeling the weight of his fears and his regrets, his desperation for escapism. From that night forward, your connection grew, but so did the risks. Draco confided in you, revealing the fragments of the dark plans he had been meant to fulfill, and together you began searching for a way to break free from the fate of his family and Voldemort had forced upon him. Finally, you went to Harry. You told him everything, though he was hurt. He listened with determination, winning over his doubts. "You can protect him," he said finally, voice grim. "If Draco's willing to turn, Dumbledore will help him." Draco's face paled, went even paler when you told him the plan. "You're asking me to betray everything my family stands for," he whispered, fear lacing his words. You took his hands, looking into his eyes. "I'm asking you to choose who you want to be, Draco, to fight for your own life, for us." He hesitated, gaze flickering between the two of you. "For you, I'll do it." The night of the betrayal came quickly. You, Draco, and Harry met in secret, devising a plan to smuggle Draco out of the castle, into the protection of Order of the Phoenix. It was a pernicious scheme, one that required perfect timing and absolute trust. But as we were about to leave, the doors flew open, and there stood Lucius, the Malfoy. His gaze cold as ice. Draco stiffened, his hand tightening around yours, but he felt his fear. "Draco," he sneered, his voice dripping in disdain. "I knew you were weak, but this..." Draco stepped forward, a face on his mask. "I'm done living in fear," he said, voice trembling, but absolute resolve. "I won't let you control me." His dad drew his wand, his face twisted with fury, but before he could act, Harry stepped in front of the both of you, his wand raised. "Back off, Malfoy." In the chaos that flows, bells flushed and echoed the halls. Lucius tried to break past Harry's defenses, but desperate to reach his son, but with one powerful hex, Harry sent him stumbling back. You seized the moment to pull Draco out of the room, Harry right behind you. Together you ran, footsteps echoing in the dark corridors, and you made your way to the safe house where Dumbledore and the Order waited for you. As dawn broke over the horizon, you and Harry stood side by side, watching the first rays of the sunlight painted with the sky of hope. He looked at you, exhaustion etched on his face, but there was a glint of peace in his eye. "Thank you," Draco whispered, his voice breaking. You leaned against him, a tear slipping down your cheek. "We're free now, Draco. We're finally free." In that moment, you knew that no matter what challenges laid ahead, you'd see them together. The world may still see him as an enemy, but to you, he was so much more. so, so much more.